All right, guys, in this section, we're going to go over contracts with your agent. So once you find an agent, ideally, they're going to have you sign some contracts. And I would just want to go over this to put you at ease. If I was hiring an agent, I absolutely would sign contracts for them just because I would want them to know that they're committed. A lot of buyers play games and they go from agent to agent, and I don't do that. I do have some integrity where it's like, listen, I'm gonna pick an agent, and I'm gonna run with them with the deal. So that's just kind of something that's important to me. And now keep in mind, this is not legal advice. This is just a personal journey of how I've signed contracts with agents to do work with them to purchase properties. So the thing is for me is that I sign these contracts to let the agent know that I'm committed to them because I want them to bring deals to me. I want them when they see opportunities or they hear something through the grapevine or something's not on the market and they hear about it. Like I want them to bring opportunities to me. And if I'm a buyer, right, and I'm playing games with different agents and stuff, and I'm an agent, why would I bring a buyer a deal if I know they're not even committed to me? So that's one of the things that to me where it's like as an investor, and if I'm using an agent, like I'm going to sign this paperwork to make sure they know that I'm committed. Now, uh, like I said, this is not legal advice. This is just from Arizona. So, for instance, Illinois for sure is going to have different contracts, but I believe the principles are the same. So, let's go ahead and go over the first contract I'm going to sign. So, after I find my agent, here are the three contracts in Arizona, for instance, to let the agent know that, hey, listen, I'm ready to rock and roll and find deals. So, the first contract I would sign is going to be a buyer broker agreement. Now, an agent is a representative of the broker, and a brokerage is essentially a firm that is permitted and licensed to purchase and sell real estate on behalf of their clients in a particular region. Now, in this case, like for instance, the buyer broker agreement is an agreement where you're officially hiring the agent exclusively, and it does outline their commission. But what I want you to realize, though, is that uh, their commission does not affect the asking price. So, for instance, if you find a property for $300,000, as the buyer, you're still going to pay $300,000 whether your agent's commission is 3% or 2%. Okay. Now, unless let's say if your agent negotiates, hey, I'm I'm going to have a 2% agent's commission, right? You would do that for two reasons. One, potentially you can drop the $300,000, right, from 300 to 297. But I would not play that game only because, for instance, you get to amortize that $3,000 over 30 years. Because if you're buying a 30-year loan, $3,000 is consequential to what you're going to get in rent income. But for the seller, for instance, they they'll if you reduce your agent's commission by 3 to 2%, then the seller potentially nets $3,000 more. So for me, I'm okay with the seller netting more because I want them motivated to take on my offer. So that's just kind of a food for thought that when as a buyer on the buyer side, try not to stress about what your agent's making. You want to keep them motivated. You want to keep your agent motivated. You want to keep your seller motivated. Okay. Where you're going to make money is making sure that the property has a solid rent income. And we're going to go over how to determine that later in a later course. Now, here's a sample uh, of a buyer contract. So the buyer broker exclusive agreement is a 2-page contract. And for instance, you can see where, hey, this is where the buyer's name, this is the brokerage firm, this is the name of the agent who represents that brokerage. And normally, whenever I sign a term, I go over 6 months. Normally, we're going to say, hey, we're going to sign a residential property. You can go over all this other stuff, read it. I never do retainer fees. Um, when it comes to due diligence, it basically means that like it's up to you to run the numbers, which I was going over later. Like they're going to help you buy the property, but like in terms of what type of property you want, at the end of the day, the due diligence is up to you. This is where I outline the commission, right? And if, for instance, um, if you let's see. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think about the other thing. Oh, let's say for instance, if you try to take on another agent and you're still under contract, you still got to pay the other agent. So, the agent that you canceled with. But on page 2 here, basically there's additional terms, which something I don't ever really worry about. I never had additional terms with an agent before. And then this is where the buyer signs and puts their address, and the brokerage uses internal office use, so you don't have to stress about that. But that's kind of like what a buyer's broker agreement looks like. Now, the second contract I would sign is something called an agency disclosure. An agency disclosure means that the agency discloses to you what their expected responsibilities are, right? And this talks about like they're basically going to help you show properties, write contracts, and place offers. So here's a sample of what an agency disclosure looks like in Arizona. Now, this is designed specifically for a buyer, where it says, hey, here is the firm's name, here is the agent who you're going to be acting through. The agent agrees to represent the buyer and the buyer's broker. The agent agrees to show properties to you. And I'll make sure that like represent the seller and the seller's broker, unless there's something called dual agency, where your agent that you are working with represents the seller as well. I would normally, like for instance, if you called a property and you reached out to the agent and you found out that that agent was representing the seller, I just wouldn't go that route, partially because at the end of the day, their loyalty is probably going to remain with the seller who they originally represented, and you're just the person who's they stumbled upon, and the agent's probably going to be happy because then they'll net more commission. But at the end of the day, though, this is what an agent disclosure goes over, talks about what their responsibilities are. And you could see that this is the reason why when I'm talking to you about like, hey, running the numbers, looking over a property, that's your responsibility. And if you look in the agent disclosure, they're literally telling you, yep, here's my responsibility. I represent you and I show you properties. That's basically it. All the due diligence, all the running the numbers, that's on you. So the next contract, last but not least, is something called marketing conditions. Essentially, this is where that buyers and sellers need to understand at the end of the day, there is variability and housing prices change. Like a house in 1950 is not going to be the same price as a house in 1990. And a house in 1990 is not going to be the same as a price in 2010. And that's because of economics, right? You have supply and demand and inflation and all these different things that are changing house prices over time. And this is basically the contract signs. And hey, Mr. Buyer, you have to be aware of the fact that house prices are not static, right? They're fluid. They change with the economy. So this is you signing the fact that you're aware of the fact that there is something called market conditions and that housing prices do vary with market conditions. So after I would sign these 3 contracts, guys, I would make sure that we're ready to go. That, hey, listen, Mr. Agent or Mrs. Agent, we're ready to start placing offers. So yeah, these are the 3 contracts I would sign after I find an agent.